So I wanted intentionally to do something a little bit lighter this week because I know you're probably hammered with other professors trying to get you all caught up and back on track, and I don't think we're off track. And I also didn't want to just do something that was detailed exactly in the book, which the first simple counter app is, and it's an easy read to figure out what it does. So I thought I'd do a counter, but we'll make it a little bit more fun. But also, I'm going to be watching the clock and trying to keep it fairly brief as well. So I've got a screenshot of what we're going for, which is a counter. There's two arrows that have been rotated, so one points up and one points down. The up button obviously counts up, and the down button counts down. And then we're going to incorporate a text field, because that's a skill we have, and a reset button to set it back to 0. So it's not rocket science, but it's a fun little app. If you can follow along, that's probably the best. And if you get stuck, feel free to stop me. All right. Okay, so we've done counters before. We've done certainly counting up. I don't know that we've done counting down. And we've done shapes and adding the tap listener to shapes. So a lot of this is stuff you're at least somewhat familiar with. So should not be a huge stretch. The exact order that we add stuff is not really important. So, but knowing what the UI looks like, you can say there's a large text display object. There's two arrows, which are polygon display objects. There's a text field, and there's a text display object next to the text field that said limit. And then there was a reset button, which I showed, which was obviously just a plain text button. Please feel free to branch out and design it, the way you want to. Okay, let's start with, how about the big text display object? So I'm going to add some text. I'm going to change it to a 0. And then I'm going to notice how small and puny it is and change the font settings. Oh, I'm going to crank it certainly at least all the way up that I can get in here. I'm going to resize the height to take into account the huge font. Just adjust it a little bit and move it a little bit out of the way to give me room for those arrows. All right, so I'm going to add a polygon, and I'm going to put it over here. So Drawnico just by default adds a triangle. So you change it by hitting the Edit Shape button down here, and you can pick a different shape. Or if you want to, you can edit the actual vertices, the XY points that are in the shape to make your own shape. I'm going to pick an arrow and then hit the Update Shape button and then say Done. And now I have the default down arrow. I can flip it around using these arrows. So I'm going to make this one point up. That's actually easier than rotating it. I'm going to duplicate the arrow so that I don't have to go through the dialog again, and I'm going to flip it down and then try to line these up. Just because of the fonts and the difference in the way Java draws stuff and locates stuff, it's not always going to be a perfect pixel-to-pixel correlation with the Solr 2D simulator, but we'll see how close it is when we get there. I'm going to add the tap listener to each of my arrows. So just selecting an arrow and then hitting Add Listener and the tap listener. And I'm going to do the same thing with the down arrow. So I select it, I hit the Add Listener button, and select tap. So at this point we do have something that we could test. If we test it now, we should see the UI as it looks, and we should get data about the taps when we tap the arrows. Obviously there's no counting. I'm going to save this in chapter 5 and about arrow counter and save it. Okay, so that's the UI. There's no counting, but when you hit the arrows, you should see information about the tap. So object 2 is the up arrow, and object 3 is the down arrow. You can obviously always hover over these if you're careful and get the object ID as well. If we want to add counting to it, then we need an app variable. So I'm going to head back to drawing a code, go to snippets, and I'm going to add a new snippet. I'm going to move it to the top, and I'm going to name it app variables. That way, if we add additional variables at some point, we'll know what snippet has it and what would make the most sense to add it to. So we've done counters. You know, we create a variable. Let me zoom in on that so you can see. So I'm editing this new snippet, and I'm just going to create a variable called count and set it equal to 0. It doesn't really matter what you call it. You just need to remember what you call it. And even the number you set it at is not really relevant, and except that it should probably match whatever is displayed as the initial number, in the UI. So if you wanted to start at 1, you could change this to 1 and that to 1, and that would still match. Right, let me also zoom into the stack so you guys can see that maybe. So let's tackle the snippets involved in the counting. So if I want to count up and tie that to the up arrow, then I need to be inside of this snippet, which in my stack is object 5. So if I select that, just for the sake of making this really clean, I'm going to delete everything. Okay, so if I want to count up, I want to add 1 to the counter, so we'll say count equals count plus 1. And then I want to update the on-screen number to match the count. So if you've forgotten, the on-screen number is object 1. You could look in your stack and find it. You could also hover over it in the UI and find it. So to update the text in the text display object, we use the object.attribute, or technically table.attribute syntax, and say object1.text equals count. It's that easy. For the down arrow, it's super similar. I'm going to select the down arrow. I'm going to get into the snippet that's tied to it. And then I'm going to count down. So I'm going to say count equals count minus. I'm going to try to say count equals count minus 1. And then object1.text equals count. All right. This is a good place to save it and see what's going on. There we go. All right. So if you're following along, you should have basic counting enabled. We want to do some stuff also with if-then logic, since that's part of this this chapter. And what I'm going to do is make sure that counter doesn't go negative. And we're also going to then implement that limit text field to make sure that it doesn't go above some limit that the user enters. The negative one's probably the simplest one. So to stop the counter from going negative, we'll want to be in the down arrow in its snippet, because that's the snippet that counts down. And we're going to need some if-then logic to do this. There are multiple right ways to do this. There are always different ways to write the logic that in the end does the same thing. So we could do it right here. I could say if count less than 0, then count equals 0. Add a comment here. Don't let count go negative. So that will, when the down arrow is pressed, is tapped, it will do the count, but then it'll double check to see if it's a valid number for the rules that we're applying. If it's not, then we'll change it so that it is a valid number. Let's save it and see. So I'm counting up, I'm counting down, and now I can't go past 0. So we've got counting up, counting down working. Let's add our reset button. That's pretty straightforward. So going back to widgets, text button, but you could use a shape button, you could use whatever you want. I'm going to put it down here. I'm going to change the text that it says reset, and then look at my stack. So my stack now has the reset text button, a press handler, and a default snippet. So I want to edit in the default snippet. That's the code that will run when the user hits the reset button. So reset should set the counter back to 0. So how do we set it back to 0? we literally just set it back to 0. You could say count equals 0. That takes whatever was in the count variable and erases it, replaces it with 0. We still want to update the display, so we'll say object1.text equals count. That should do it, unless there's always the possibility that I've forgotten something or made a mistake, but let's count up and then hit reset. Hey, there we go. Can't count down, can count up, can reset whenever we want to. All right, so the text field then. Let's add a text field. I'm going to start it out just displaying 100, so the limit is 100, we'll say, to begin with. I'm going to switch the alignment. I'm going to add a little bit of text next to it, a text display object, so that we don't just have a text field there with a number in it that the user has to guess you know what it does. We want to be as clear as possible, so I'm going to say upper limit. Also, the default font size for these is a bit big. I'm going to switch it to 24, which is a better size for a label next to a widget. So that sets the UI up for what we want to do. Now we need the logic. So we'll want to check the upper limit when the up arrow is pressed, right? That's the only time the upper limit comes in to play. Just like we only checked it for 0 for the counting down, for the counting up, we'll check it against the limit in the text field. So let's get back into the up arrow and its snippet, and I'm going to zoom into it. So same kind of idea here. I want to count up, but I don't want it to go past the limit. So I need more if-then logic to do this. The limit is whatever text is in here, the text field, which is object 13. So let's start by just getting that limit. I'm going to say limit equals object13.text, and I'm going to print the limit at the console to make sure I'm getting it. And the only thing that always gives me pause is whatever I type into that text field is text. I didn't change the style. So if it gives us any grief, we'll take an extra step. But right now I just want to see what the limit is, see if I'm seeing it correctly in the spot of the code where I want to see it. And so I am. If you look down at the console, you'll see 100, 100, 100. Well, so we're getting the limit, and we know we don't want to go past the limit. So the kind of logic we want is an if statement. And we want to say if count is greater than limit, then count equals limit. So it's analogous to, it's parallel to in lots of ways logically to what we did with the down arrow to stop it from going negative. The difference is this is now customizable in the UI. So instead of hard coding it at 100, say, we're allowing the user to change that number. So let's see if it works. Okay, so I'm going to change the limit to 10. All right, so this is the problem. It says attempt to compare a string with a number. So this is where having these super flexible data types is, nice in that it ran the app, but then when it actually tried to do it, then it decided it had a data type mismatch. So let's first try changing the input type to number, which I think will work. And if it doesn't, there's one more thing to do. And this would also, in terms of the UI, if this was on an actual phone, it would give you the numeric keypad rather than the full-on, keyboard alphanumeric keypad. So just with that one little change, let's see. Well, all right, 11. I'll stick with 11. Okay, doesn't like that. Attempt to compare a string to a number. So last thing to get rid of this pesky error is we're going to change limit to make sure it's a number. So we're going to do that by using a function called toNumber. All right, so I'm in that same snippet we're working on right before the if statement. I've changed this line of code. That line of code used to say limit equals object13.text. So instead, it says toNumber object13.text. I just added this function called toNumber, the open parentheses, then enclosed the object13.text with the closed parentheses. So that says take the text from the text field and turn it into a number if possible. So if the user does type in a number, it will then turn it into a number. If the user types something that isn't a number, then toNumber is going to complain that it can't do it. But if you've set the input type on the text field to number, the user on an actual device shouldn't be able to type anything but a number. I did save it already, so let's see if it likes it this time. So 10. Okay, it's not complaining, but is it going to work, right? This is tense, isn't it? All right, we're at 10. I hope it works. Hey, it's working. So we've got 2 limits on the counting. Using if-then logic, we've got a text button to do a reset. And we're reading in a number out of a text field and going through multiple steps to make sure it's treated as a number in Solr 2D Corona. All right. Well, that's what I wanted to hit. I think that summarizes most of the material in the chapter and integrates in the text field. And text fields can be a little bit picky, and which we demonstrated. That is the follow along activity for this morning.